Well, hello, friends. How's everybody doing on this fine summer day? We are reading through the Bible and we are in the middle of the Psalms. What I'm going to talk about today, I think, is actually from yesterday's reading. If you're following the Bible reading plan along with me, there's a lot of Psalms each day, about 5 or so, right? But a lot of them are pretty short. So it's not too much of I don't think, of a heavy lift to kind of work through these Psalms here. I want to talk about one snippet from Psalm 49, and then I want to talk about one of the most well-known, perhaps, Psalms, Psalm 51, that we do have connected to a historical event. One of the things from Psalm 49 that I want to point out is because of, if you remember, one of the things that I've been kind of looking for or drawing attention to as we've walked through this Bible story is what's discussed about life after death. And I think what we've seen so far, at least what I've seen so far, is not a lot. There's not a lot of robust or specific hope about what happens after we die. It's a very this focused life, sustaining a long life, and then the resting with your fathers or ancestors is kind of the term that's used for death. But again, it's tough to say, what does that mean? What doesn't that mean? And these kind of things. Psalm 49 has what seems like a bit of a clue or something as we kind of move forward and build out a little bit more deeply as time goes on, what's going on here. So in Psalm 49, the author here is comparing the wicked with the righteous, something that happens a lot in the Psalms. Let me start in verse 12, and I'll get to verse 15 is where I'm going. Psalm 49 verse 12 says, "People, despite their wealth, do not endure. They are like the beasts that perish. This is the fate of those who trust in themselves and of their followers who approve their sayings. They are like sheep who are destined to die. Death will be their shepherd, but the upright will prevail over them in the morning." So you see a little bit of a theme here about what's going on, just kind of this wrestling with the those who are not righteous, not following God, and that certainly they seem to do okay sometimes, but he's sort of like, well, it's coming. So a lot to be said about this throughout the biblical literature. We'll get to Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, and we'll see again more of these kind of things. But check out this. In the second part now, verse 14 into verse 15. Their forms will decay in the grave, far away from their princely mansions. But God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. He will surely take me to himself. So, wow. And again, I'm not doing research behind here. I'm not digging into commentaries on this, but on the surface of my translation, this seems to be kind of a more interesting and perhaps substantial kind of move forward in thinking or revelation about what happens after death. Now, it's interesting here that it's still sort of vague, and there's not a lot about, so like, sometimes we'll talk about like heaven and hell as kind of opposing destinations. That's not going on in this passage of scripture yet. David's saying kind of like, or whoever's the author of this particular thing, it doesn't actually say Psalm 49 is a Psalm of David. Just kind of default to David a lot of times with the Psalms. But in any case, the psalmist, that's the safe way of speaking of the authorship, right, is saying that the default is death. Even those who are rich and they're boastful and they don't serve God in this life, well, they're going to die. They're going to be in the grave. But he says, again, the author here says, but God will redeem me from the realm of the dead. Interesting stuff. And I'm just kind of tracking with these as we walk through the Bible, what's said about life after death and kind of how should we think about that. But it is interesting to note the opposite or the lack thereof. There's no, hey, if you're not righteous, you're going to burn in hell. Like, no, that's not here. So interesting. Again, we'll keep on tracking as we go forward. None of these things that I'm mentioning here along the way are intended to be like a final word about anything. Remember, what we're doing is tracking through the biblical story, and there's more revelation as time goes on. There's more understanding that happens as we move forward in the biblical story. So just keep in mind that there. So Psalm 51 is really a well-known psalm. It's specifically connected here to a situation, an author in a situation, as when we did the introductory video that my friend Judd joined me, he mentioned that these superscriptions of sort, these descriptions at the beginning of the Psalms aren't likely original, but yet they're early. So that's something to kind of take note of. And of course, that makes a lot the context that we read about when we were in the books like 2 Samuel, talked about David, Bathsheba, and Uriah and all that. Wow, reading this psalm in terms of that story makes a lot of sense, right? So that description at the beginning of Psalm 51 says this: for the director of music, a psalm of David, where the prophet Nathan came to him after David had committed adultery with Bathsheba. So really an interesting, a lot interesting in here. I'll read, how much of it should I read? I'll start at the beginning and read a bit. Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash away all my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. Now, this is interesting because we've seen a lot of times, and I think even, I'm trying to remember back to specific occurrences, but like David saying, kind of, Lord, do good to me because of my righteousness, because of my blamelessness, because I seek you. We kind of see that sort of thing throughout the Psalms, I think a fair amount too. Reward me according to my steadfastness and righteousness and that kind of thing. But he's in a different situation now. This is not a situation where David's been faithful. Far, far, far from it. And we kind of get down to the root thing here, where it's really not about us at all, but it's about leaning on God, who God is, right? God's character. So he says, have mercy on me according to your unfailing love, according to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin, right? So this is him just falling on God's grace and mercy, which we see right throughout the biblical story in various ways. For I know, verse 3, for I know my transgressions and my sin is always before me. It's really, I don't know if you've been at times in life like this. It's kind of, this has been the case for me sometimes, where it's interesting how there's been times where I've had not a lot of like conviction of sin. Like I don't know if I've just made excuses or things that didn't really like weigh on me with that weight of conviction. And then sometimes things that I, again, previously kind of made excuses for just became weighty and heavy. And I just realized the kind of, how real my sin is. And it's interesting, in light of this, my sin is ever before me, or it's kind of just like, it's like he feels the weight of it. And it really, in a sense, wasn't until the confrontation with Nathan, the prophet, that it seems like he felt this way. He was kind of washing it aside, hiding it. Maybe thought he got away with it. And then the conviction comes, in this case, through another person. And so it's interesting how that works out sometimes. Verse 4 is interesting. And here's where we get both theological realities and both limits of poetic language. So let me explore this for a second. So verse 4 says, against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. Is that true? Is that thoroughly true? Against you only, God, have I sinned? It's interesting. I wonder if Uriah would like to have a word with David about that. I wonder if Bathsheba may want to have a word with David about that. But it's not, this is not here undermining this passage of scripture. It's simply saying that David is focusing himself on here really, and that it's not just others that I've wronged. Ultimately, the sins that we commit against others are not only against them, but ultimately they're against God, right? Who created us all in his image and gives us, these instructions to follow. So if we just think, oh, I did this against somebody, and if I can just kind of make it go away or get them to say it's okay, then I'm all right. No, you also have to deal with that when you and I sin, it's an offense against God, God himself. And so I think David's feeling the weight against it. It's not that he's only sinned against God and not the people that Uriah that he had killed. He certainly sinned against him. But he's kind of feeling the weight of this in the direction that I've got to get things right with you, God. It's not enough that it's just with right with other people. Verse 5, surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me, sinful in the womb. And again, it's interesting because so often throughout David's life, he's talked about his blamelessness before God. And again, I think we need to be careful with this is David here making an ultimate theological statement about sin or and it may be, or maybe somewhere in between that, or is he primarily talking about, I realized in this moment how thoroughly sinful I am. And it's kind of like that reality is ever before me. It's sort of like it just seems to be the encompassing reality of of my situation. So interesting stuff to kind of wrestle with and think about the theology and the poetry and the weight in the moment and all of these things that kind of wrap together in this particular psalm. So he's, in any case, if we kind of move through the major moves of this psalm, we see both David is appealing to God's compassion and mercy in his situation, not himself. Because why? Because his sinfulness is so exposed now. It's so thorough. It's deeper than he thought it was. It's huge. And now he's feeling the weight of it in a way that perhaps he hadn't before. So his desire then, so the appeal to God, the realization of his sinfulness, his desire to be cleansed, right? Cleanse me and I will be clean. Wash me and I will be whiter than snow. Let me hear joy and gladness. Let these bones you have crushed rejoice. And again, that's something we can realize, that there's poetic language here. Have any of David's literal bones been crushed? No, they haven't been. It's a statement that kind of relates to his kind of current status. Just, I feel like, oh my goodness, like I've been overwhelmed, crushed, undone by this situation and the consequences that are due because of it, right? Hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquity, right? Like cover over my sins, right? Not just let my sins go away, but let me be a changed person is the next move, right? Verse 10. There's a great course song many of us probably know based on this. Create in me a clean heart, a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Don't cast me away from your presence, although that would be justified in this situation, right? Or take your spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me, right? So I depend on your grace. I'm totally sinful. I want to be restored. And then finally, verse 13, then I will teach transgressors your ways so that sinners will turn back to you. Open my lips, Lord, and I will declare your praise. Then the last thing I want to mention about this is because this is popping up in a couple of these Psalms here about sacrifices, offerings. This will get picked up very much in the prophets, in the prophetic writings. And I want us to be careful about this because these statements aren't saying that the offerings and the sacrifices don't matter. But as we've seen in like Second Kings and the Chronicles, etc., that the sacrifices alone, the offerings alone, without the life that's intended to want to seek God, is very ineffective. And God has no really care for it, right? So look at what he says here in the Psalm 51 that we've been exploring, verse 16. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. Right? So that ultimately we see that this, the sacrificial system, the offerings and things that we've learned about a lot in Leviticus and other places are not an end unto themselves. They're intended, remember, to sustain a relationship where God dwells among us and we're a people that are shaped to live in his presence, to live as he's called us to be in the world. And so these things all connect in together. What are your thoughts? What are you thinking about the Psalms so far? What are you thinking about Psalm 51? I'd love to hear some thoughts from you as well. Okay, I'll see you again soon.